You are listening to episode 22 of the Lewis and Kyle Show with Mike Case.
So it's 136 years old. It now has its fifth generation of ownership working at the company. If you've done any statistics, if you look at the number of family organizations that make it to the third generation, it's about 30%. That make it to a fourth generation, it's about 15%. And to make it beyond there, it gets down into the low single digits. So that in and of itself is rather remarkable.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lewis and Kyle Show, an interview podcast where Kyle and I bring on experts based on our curiosities, whether that's real estate, entrepreneurship, technology, or any other field. We bring them on to learn more about them and about what they're so knowledgeable about.
Today we have on Mike Case. This is one of my favorite interviews that we've ever done. Mike prepared so thoroughly for this interview. He sent us 6 pages of notes to look through before we even had our conversation. Mike spent 33 years with the Westervelt Company, a privately owned timberland company that operates out of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where he spent the last 17 years as a CEO. As will be made obvious throughout this interview, Mike has an incredible way of looking at the world and a unique way of problem solving. We get into how he sets goals, how he develops habits, communicates, and sets routines for himself. Today, Mike is enjoying retirement by continuing to improve, learn, and serve those around him. We really enjoyed this conversation. We got a lot out of it, and we hope that you will too.
With that, we're going to cut to it.
Hello, Mike. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Well, it's a pleasure, Kyle. Nice to be with you. And Lewis, nice to meet you virtually. Look forward to getting to know both of you better.
Yeah, it's great meeting you as well, and hopefully in Alabama in a few months we'll all be able to get together in person. I just want to start out by saying that you put a ton of preparation into our show, and we really, really appreciate that thought you put in with some of the documents you presented to us for reviewing the materials on your thoughts and different things. So we wanted to start things off by getting a little meta and asking you about the framework you provided us for how to have high quality conversations. So before we start the conversation, get an idea of what makes a good conversation so we can keep it in mind for our chat. You shared with us that the measure of a conversation, the measure of the quality of a conversation is the degree of learning that occurs. So how do you ensure a quality conversation, and what are the prerequisites to an authentic conversation taking over?
Okay, well, a lot of the nomenclature and the terms I'm going to use came from a book that was written back in the 90s called The Communication Catalyst. Mickey Connolly and Richard Rianishek are the authors, and I got to know them. They did some work for us when we were doing a joint venture with Georgia Pacific, trying to bring two cultures together. And obviously everything you do in life is based on having a quality of communication and learning and listening. So the things I'll share and some of their mental models that we'll talk about, I want to give them proper credit. So what's the basis of a quality conversation? Well, I think it starts off with understanding that the conversation is 2 pieces. There's the talking part and the listening part. And a lot of people think the listening part is just waiting to talk. And it's quite different from that. So I think what we have to realize is that every person brings 3 unique things to every conversation. The 3 of us tonight, we bring what we call the essential purpose. It's what is it you're for? What are the things, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What do you want to accomplish? So that's always there with you. The next part would be the concerns. What am I worried about? What I want to try to avoid? And then finally, each of us has a particular set of circumstances that we live within. And some of those are negotiable, some of them are not, but they do exist, and they'll define that. So as we go into a conversation, the point about the degree, the quality is based on the degree of learning. I think we start off with that curiosity about not how do I win the negotiation or how do I win the debate, it's what can I learn? So the first thing you start off with is you try to understand the other party, what's important to them, why that's important, what their concerns are, and then what their situation is. So with that in mind, we start off, the dialogue is to ask questions. One of the things that was new to me when I first met Richard and Mickey was I'm not a psychologist, although I did like psychology in college, but I didn't learn a lot about how people respond and react. And one of the things that I did learn is that we're hardwired. Our brains have evolved to a very, very high level over millions of years, and we're hardwired to be able to perceive things quickly. The slow part of our ancestors didn't make it very long. So what we've evolved from are the faster thinking, the quicker responses. The brain has 3 primary parts that are part of this. There is the cerebral cortex. That's the part of your brain that uses logic, deductive reasoning and that type of thing. It processes knowledge, but with some analytical component. Then there's the thalamus, and the thalamus is the other sensory input that takes information in from your surroundings, and then it does two things. It'll send it to the cortex for further processing, but it also sends it to the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that makes the quick decisions. You've heard of the fight, flight, flee
Definitely.
response. Okay, well, that's kind of where it occurs. The amygdala puts a value on speed over accuracy, so it responds quickly. It will quickly look for what's called fast past matching. It looks for things that have happened before and says, this must be like that. It also perceives a social threat with the same degree of concern as the physical threat. So those are the things that, I think I'm answering your question backwards. What gets in the way of an authentic or quality conversation? It's kind of partly our natural DNA. It's our predisposition, our response, and sometimes the biases that our life history is kind of, and our experiences kind of cause us to develop biases. Those aren't always bad because it allows you to process things quickly, but the danger in doing that is you kind of miss the real intention by the other party in the conversation.
Yeah, you had mentioned to us on a similar note that there are some actual physical cues that can be telltales of when someone's in that not prepared state for being in a place to accept learning and be open-minded. What are some of those cues?
Great question, Lewis. And these things are going to happen. There's no way to train yourself because it's a response that your body and your brain doesn't say don't do it. It just happens. The best we can do is to catch them quickly and then try to kind of slow the things down. So some of the physical cues, you think about a conversation that you're having and you start getting, quote, upset. Typically then your heart rate goes up. Your breathing becomes a little shallow. You probably get a little tension in your neck. Somebody were looking at you, your pupils dilate a little bit. Those are all biological responses, what we call bioreaction. Those are going to happen. You can't stop that. What you can do is make yourself aware that it's happening quickly. And don't let it kind of build upon itself. So just train yourself to look for those cues, and when you do, you take a deep breath. Then you ask a question that is not a yes or no response. So you're trying to find out, what you're really seeking to do, Lewis, is to find out go back to their essential purpose. What is it they're here for? So they may say something that you kind of want to push back on, and disagree. But I think we talked about this earlier. When you get pushback, it's time to get curious. Find out why there's pushback, and then kind of self-examine, why am I having this response? What am I threatened by? Because all the things we talked about are responses to threats, social threats primarily, but they're responses to threats. So if you can simply get, I've been married 41, almost 42 years, and I know in the conversations I have with my wife, if there's a certain way she phrases something or a certain word that gets used, I can feel it. Now, after 42 years, I catch it pretty quickly. I may stare at the floor, I may walk out of the room, I may do something else, but you get better at catching yourself. And that's how you can then redirect the conversation to something more productive. But one of the things that I love that Mickey and Richard did in their book is they use something called a conversation meter. And they say really all conversations can fall into one of four categories. We'll talk about them from the lowest quality conversation to the highest. And the lowest quality conversation is one that's in pretense. Pretense is when you want to avoid something, you're trying to eliminate something that's uncomfortable. You just kind of you may act like you're going along with it and then walk out of the room and go, that was crazy. But you're not giving somebody the benefit of letting them know your thoughts and emotions. The next step up from pretense is sincerity. Sincerity is opinions masquerading as facts. So you've got some things in your head that you strongly believe in, and you treat them as if they're facts. Sincerity means telling somebody, quote, what you really think. It almost always starts off with, well, to be really honest with you. So really what you're saying is, I'm not trying to engage in a dialogue here. I'm going to tell you what I think you need to hear. Well, that's better than pretense, because at least something's coming out, right? So that's kind of step two. The third step up is accuracy. Now, accuracy shifts from explanations, my thought about why that occurred, to actual facts. So that's an improvement. The downside of that is inaccuracy. You're generally trying to come up with facts that support your position. You've heard of confirmation bias?
Yes.
So you're looking for, you're still looking for facts, but you still feel some need to defend your position. So your brain's not quite open to listening and learning. It's trying to logically put together information as to why you're right. Still better than the other two, but that's not quite exactly where we want to end up. The fourth one is what we call authenticity. And that builds upon accuracy. And I'm open to facts, and I'm trying to get away from explanations. But in authenticity, you start looking for the intersection between your view, my view, and we accept that we may have different views. So you just think of two arrows kind of crossing together, and then within that intersection, there's the relevant facts. So if we can keep digging around and find out not where we differ, but where do we intersect? What are the things we really can, they call it the axiom of the intersection. Where can you find those things? And that's where learning occurs. Now, to do that, and this is hard, but to do that, you have to give up the need to be correct for the chance to learn. Almost all of us, when we're talking or in a conversation, we're trying to make a point, there is this innate need to be correct. No one wants to be incorrect intentionally. So to get to the chance to learn, though, you have to sometimes just kind of put that aside and say, okay, I'll stop that. What can I learn here? And make this sound like it all happens in about 3 minutes, and it doesn't. A lot of this is based on the trust of the relationship. How long have you known this person? How open and transparent can you be? But I've always I can sit around in any setting and put conversations into those categories. And nobody really wants to be in pretense. Sometimes you feel like you're bullied or you have no real voice. And unfortunately, I think most of the social discourse in our country now and for some time now, which one of those four categories would you put it into?
Opinions that are based on nothing. Sincerity, right? It would be the second level.
I'm thinking you need to hear it.
What's really interesting is that all of this is happening in your brain. Like you were saying how the information gets processed through your brain, but immediately upon engaging in a conversation with somebody in front of you, your amygdala is deciding how it's going to be or how you're going to respond. So you're kind of constrained by the other person just as much as you are by yourself about whether or not the conversation is going to be sincerity, accuracy, or authenticity. And I'm excited that this conversation has that pretense of all of us being willing and wanting to get to the point where we're learning from it. And this is a safe space where we can all be wrong consistently. And I know that Lewis and I do that all the time. We're wrong all the time. But I guess stepping back a bit from having a good conversation into actually having a good conversation is some of your experience as CEO of Westervelt. So for our listeners, can you quickly explain what Westervelt, your company, does, or your company?
Oh, yes, thank you. It's still a company, just not, well, I now get my monthly check from them, so I want them to do well for a long time to come. Quick history of the company. It was formed in 1884, so it's 136 years old. It now has its fifth generation of ownership working at the company. If you've done any statistics, if you look at the number of family organizations that make it to the third generation, it's about 30%. That make it to a fourth generation, it's about 15%. And to make it beyond there, it gets down into the low single digits. So that in and of itself is rather remarkable. I attribute that to the fact that there's always been one decision maker with every generation that had voting control. So they would take the input and say, this is what we're going to do. There weren't a lot of strategic shifts along the way, but the Westervelt company has always been in the land resources, forestry, forest products. So there's always been that commonality from 1884 when they made butcher paper out of wheat straw up in Illinois to today. We're no longer in the paper business or the packaging business, but we've got 500,000 acres of timberland. We've got building our second very, very large sawmill, so we make a lot of lumber. We've got an ecological services business that does mitigation banking, which protects critical habitat, whether it be water or species. We're probably one of the largest companies in this country that does that. So those are the things that what I always thought. I worked for the company for 33 plus years. One of the reasons I think that we had such little turnover, and at one point we had 3,000 employees when I became the CEO in 2000. Today it's probably closer to 700. But there's this sense of family, not that you're part of the family, but there's this perpetuation and a commitment to sustainability and doing the right thing. One of our third generation chairman and CEO used to say, we can make money doing a lot of different things. We can't go to sleep at night feeling good about those things unless it's what we want to do. So those are always the things that have guided us. So they may not have written down vision and values in the early 1900s, but they operated in much the same way. Leave the world a better place than when you found it. Treat people fairly. Invest in your communities.
Is mostly or can be attributed to the fact that it was a family-run company. One of your quotes that you sent to us was, "You don't inherit the land; you give it to the generations to come, or you're borrowing it from the generations to come." So being focused on family really makes that an easy decision to make, to want to make the world better, because if it is better and your company's doing better, then your kids will have better lives. But so we want to focus mostly on your time as CEO. But I mean, you're with the company from 1981 to 2017. That's a long time. So can you walk us through just quickly, like your ladder up the company?
Okay. Yeah, somewhere in there. We can talk about that as well. So I finished, let me step back before I joined the company. So I finished undergraduate school, and my wife and I got married when we were both in college. New Year's Eve, 1978. And against everybody's advice, that you shouldn't do this, you're too young. Well, anyway, we did. So I finished school. She was a year younger. And then I was attending bar, which one of my favorite all-time jobs, because it's such a psychologist workshop. I mean, I love just getting to read people, know people. And it kind of makes you good at everything that you're all talking about doing. You learn how to have conversations, how to listen, know when to shut up, when to say something. So anyway, I had another year to go. So I got my master's here. So I've got an undergraduate in marketing. I've got a master's degree in marketing. I started off at business school in accounting. My father got his MBA in accounting. And for some reason, I thought I should get an accounting degree. When I got to intermediate accounting, I don't know if it's still the tough course that it was way back then, but that's when they separated the people that wanted to be accountants from the people that were just kind of sampling the course. So I decided that wasn't for me. Enjoyed psychology, but didn't really think I could see myself making a living at that, knowing that, I was married. So marketing to me was the perfect blend of those things. Marketing has some hard components to it and some soft components to it. So anyway, I've always enjoyed marketing. I was in school back when Barry Mason was still in the classroom, and a guy named Morris Mayer, who y'all don't have the opportunity to know, but Morris was a legend in retail marketing. So did all those things, finished in 1981. A guy that I attended bar with, his father worked at Gulf States Paper. I didn't know who he was, but I knew he had a pretty good job because he lived at North River. So I was interviewing with some other companies. I really wanted to be a brand manager at Procter & Gamble. That was my dream job, because that was just kind of, I thought, a cool thing to do. But anyway, I interviewed at Gulf States Paper. Turned out his father was an executive vice president, ran a division, and I was fortunate enough to get hired to go to work in that division. So I spent my first 4 years in sales, just out on the road, calling on people, trying to, I was in the packaging division. So specifically the group I was with, we made food service packaging. So if somebody fries chicken and puts it in a box, we probably made that box. We were doing business with KFC and Church's and Popeyes, and we had a big account at Disney World, was a big account at one point in time. So that was, I enjoyed, the sales cycle was long. You didn't walk in and say, I got a product, buy it. You try to find out what their needs are. You solve problems. You use your internal resources. You do those things. So that was wonderful. Love that. About that time, our two children, 84 and 86, were born. And I'll go ahead and kind of say, and then I decided to do something different. I had some friends from college that were in the investment banking business. They were selling bonds. A big operation in Birmingham. It was called Central Bank of the South then. Now I think it's BBVA. But they had a huge trading operation. And I was just fascinated with the financial side. And these were bonds. So we're selling primarily government agency securities to insurance companies, S&Ls, and banks. So I did that for close to 3 years and traveled a lot. But like everything, it goes into a cycle. And being on straight commission is always, that'll get you up in the morning. But also then having a family that was starting to grow a little bit, I was kind of thinking about, well, a little bit more of a steady, predictable future would be okay. And I'd stayed in touch with some of my contacts at Gulf States Paper and went back to work there in '88. And oddly enough, I went to work in a purchasing position, which is the exact opposite of what I had done in the sales side. So I was working again for the packaging division, and I was buying raw materials and equipment and supplies for 5 carton plants scattered across the whole country. So that was great because I got a chance to learn what the other side was like. So when I eventually got back into the sales side, I had sat in that purchasing manager's position and I understand the things that drove their decision makers, the things that they were concerned about, and the things that they were scared about. So did that for a couple of 3 or 4 years, and then in another division I had a chance to go in as a marketing manager. At that time, Jack Warner was still very much running the company. We had 3 major divisions. One made pulp and paperboard, and that was in Demopolis, Alabama. Those are big, expensive mills at probably $500 million to $1 billion capitalization. So big operation. And then we had 7 or 8 folding carton plants, and then we had the Woodlands part, which at that time was about 300,000 acres. So got a chance to do that. I was being groomed to be a sales manager. And unfortunately for him, the guy that I was working for that was going to retire in 2 years contracted or diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and passed away in about 3 months. So I got shoved into that job pretty quickly. Again, back out on the road, I'll bless my wife. I felt like she raised the kids and did that for about 3 years. And then at that time, Jack really wanted to build another machine in Demopolis. And that's, as I just said, that had been about a $500 million investment. One of the first rules at Westervelt, previously Gulf States, was keep this a family-owned, privately held company. So never take a risk that if you're wrong, the banks or somebody else owns the company. Because we wanted to perpetuate it. We'd had a generational time horizon when we made decisions. So our goal was to perpetuate this generation to generation, doing these kind of things. So like I said, Jack was really interested in putting in another machine. I was told my job was to convince him that that was not a good decision. So I spent about 1.5 years in a strategy and planning role for the company, pulling together the data. And then when I convinced him that we couldn't spend the money on the machine, I had some contacts in the industry, and we ended up doing a joint venture with a company that was called Georgia Pacific. They were a very large, publicly traded company, and they had kind of almost gotten out of that business. They had 1 machine left, and it was an encore business for them. So we developed a joint venture. So we got all the benefits of a second machine. We got to run efficiencies across 2 machines. We took one competitor out of the market because we did all the marketing for it. And both owners of the companies would tell you it was a real win-win for everybody. So we got all the benefits of growth without a $500 million investment. So that worked out quite well. I guess because that worked out quite well, they said, once we put the joint venture together, my boss says, well, good. That was such a wonderfully elegant decision and so intelligent. Now go do it. So I had to go run that business for about 3.5, 4 years. And it's just a marketing guy going into a paper mill, which is like a chemical plant and an energy plant all together, filled with engineers. So I was, once again, you have to know what you don't know. And I realized that, to make intelligent decisions and the right investments, I had to learn a little engineering. So I had a couple guys that would kind of take me aside and kind of teach me engineering one-on-one, enough to be able to make decisions. That business ran well. We made good money. And it was a time for Ed Woods was his name. When Ed's time to retire came up, there were 3 executive vice presidents. I was the youngest. I was 43 at the time. Didn't really expect it. I think one of the questions you asked me once was, when did you know that you were going to get to be the president? And I would say I knew about 1 day before a board meeting. I was on the board at the time. I joined the board in '95. And my boss said, oh, by the way, we're going to be talking about this at the board meeting, and you're going to be the next CEO. And I was just floored because I didn't expect it. And I think one of the other two people that expected it didn't like it. So that was another thing about how to have an authentic conversation, because now my peer became somebody that reported to me. But I learned a lot from that. So I became the president and CEO in 2000, and then we had a major sale in 2005. We sold off. We knew that we were going to have to recapitalize that mill at some point in time. We knew that we didn't want to take the risk of borrowing too much money. So we sold that business and the packaging business, which took the product we made at the mill and converted it into packaging, to what was then Rock 10. It's public. It was a $540 million transaction. They're a public company. We were a private company. That was hard because it's one of those things where people ask you what's going on and you can't say anything about it because we're not in a position to say anything about it. So we got through that. We ended up 90% of the people that work in those businesses were offered jobs with Rock 10. That was part of why that mattered to us. And then we took the proceeds and started, growing the timber side of the business, and then we developed the ecological services business. So our intention was within 10 years to make it much easier for the family to perpetuate it, as a private company. So we don't have a lot of volatility. We don't have a lot of risk. We've got a lot of appreciating assets as part of the base. So it's been, I look back to the history of the company, and they've kind of kept doing those things. One time we were in the paper bag business, and then plastics came along and kind of made it obsolete. We shifted to the packaging business. And then with the cost of capital and the money required to stay in that business exceeded our comfort level, we shifted it into more growing, appreciating assets. So like I said, today we've got 500,000 acres of timberland. We've got 40,000 acres in New Zealand. We've got about 25,000 acres in long-term conservation easements for the mitigation banking business. So I think we've achieved a really balanced portfolio of businesses that attracts high-quality people.
I definitely want to come back to the idea of pivoting and finding the profits in a vertically integrated company like Westervelt. But I want to ask a quick question about what it was like for you to be the CEO of a company whose vision is specifically to perpetuate itself as a family-owned company, and you being someone who wasn't a part of the family, but you had sole voting power to make decisions within it. What was that like to not be a part of the family, but to be making decisions directly for the family?
Yeah, I'll clarify. I did not have the sole voting power. That was always a family member. And I think that's one of the things that perpetuated the company. Jack Warner's mother was Mildred Warner. She was the CEO, if you will, when they built the mill in Tuscaloosa in the late 20s. And that's when they started buying some timberlands. And then she passed that along to her son, Jack Warner, in about 57 or 58. And he accelerated the purchasing of timberlands and then got us into the packaging business. And then his son, John Warner, I think John became chairman and majority shareholder. That's the distinction. It's just who owns the voting stock in like the late 90s. And then John, who's early 70s, semi-retired, spends a lot of time in New Zealand, but one of his children, he's got 3 children, will likely give him the voting control of the company. So you always had that thread that ran through all that. Now for me, the management was expected to go out and execute on our business plans. So we typically, I saw, other than the shareholders that live locally, and we had at one point about 65 shareholders, all family members. So there weren't a gazillion of them, and a lot of them live locally. So we would have annual shareholders meetings, and they would all kind of pile in there and ask a bunch of questions. And for the most part, they as long as we kept them informed, nobody really took an exception over. I don't think we were anything controversial. We didn't go into something that challenged somebody's values. Now, did they all agree about, do we need another mill or do we need one of these things? No, but they weren't in that business. So one of the things that was a change, when I got on the board of directors in the mid-90s, we had maybe 15 board members. We had a lot of managers that worked at the companies. The executive vice presidents were on the board. We had a lot of family members on the board. And we'd have 2 or 3 outside, if you will, directors that were independent. When I retired, that number was down to 7 board members, 5 outside directors, the CEO, and the chairman. And that was a much more functioning board because it was easier to have those conversations, and they were all experienced in board governance, the kind of things the board should and shouldn't do. I was lucky. I had some fabulous board members that I learned a lot from their experience. Their motto was, we can look but don't touch. So they would give us advice, but they never kind of got down into the weeds of trying to tell you how to run a company. So I was very grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did I answer your question?
No,
Okay.
Yeah, you did. And I think it's great. I want to come back, though, to the vertically integrated profits question. So what I'm asking basically is, with a company like Westervelt, from your own words, it's woods to goods. You've got everything from the land and the trees and the processes all the way through to, let's say, paper bags. How did you go about your decision making when trying to find where exactly you could maximize the profits in that chain of things? Because you could sell it at any point. You could sell it as wood. You could sell it as paper bags. You know?
Right. Great question, Kyle. And it's the woods to goods was actually in the 40s and 50s. That was a company motto that was printed on a lot of our logos. And that was kind of, Jack always was fond of saying woods to goods. So I think that there was a comfort level of being able to control the steps in processing. So, if you own the land, you didn't have to own, we probably at the Demopolis mill, we sourced 60% of our wood internally and 40% externally. So we were never totally integrated, but enough to control it. And that was kind of the issues. We wanted to be able to control the quality, remove some of the transaction costs from dealing with third parties, and where that value is captured can shift through time. And it can shift in market cycles. There are times when it's the people that have the trees, they call it on the stump. So the people that own that, they're the ones that make the money. They're a high component of the overall cost down the road. So we'll use that as an example. We grow the trees. We grow southern yellow pine, which is because this is what grows best here. We've now gotten that growth cycle from 45 years down to 25 years by better genetics, better silvicultural practices. We can grow better trees. Well, we thought, well, if we're doing that to capture the value of those trees, we need to process those logs. So we built a sawmill that is full of automation and optical. Every log that goes on the log deck gets scanned, and within a second, it will tell the saws later on in the process how to cut that log based on the selling prices of all the types of lumber you could cut out of that log. That's how precise it is. Now, we could change the prices throughout the day if we wanted to. We don't. We usually change them about once a week. So it's capturing the value for us and for our customers. And let's say that can shift. If we wanted to, we looked at it. One of the things that happens to lumber in the South, primarily if it's dimensional lumber, with structural lumber, which is kind of the walls holding up the structure, is a lot of that gets treated, chemically treated, pressure treated. Great Southern, if the Yellow Man, you've seen those commercials, and they're a big player in that market. Yellowwood. So we thought about, well, that's one extension of going downstream, and turned out there was a lot of complications to it that we didn't particularly like. So I think the integration model is one that's always been comfortable. When we, in the mid 2004 or 5, about the time we made the divestiture of those two businesses, we were looking at, after we paid our taxes and after we paid a nice dividend to our shareholders, we had money left over, a fair amount of money left over. What do we do with it? So one of the things was, let's just increase our footprint and buy more timberland. Well, where do we buy it? So we went through a very intentional, thorough process. We actually did a process. We looked around the entire world and said, where's the best place to buy? Where do we want to own timberland 50 years from now, 100 years from now? Well, we ended up with some in New Zealand for some different reasons, but it was through that process of saying, this might be a place we want to be in 50 years. We made that investment. And then we bought more timberland here, but So you get the vertical integration, but there's also a horizontal component to it. And I had a friend that was a CFO of EBSCO Industries in Birmingham back then, his name Rick Bazzelli, and I got to know him through a bunch of things we were looking at doing perhaps together. And they were looking at a lot of deals. And he called me one day and said, hey, we've got this deal that's at my desk. It doesn't fit us. It's about mitigation banking, and it involves owning land for it's a long-term commitment to land. We just don't do that. So I took it, looked at it, went out, talked to the guys that were going to sell it. One thing led to another. We didn't buy that company, but some of their key people left and started their own company. And that's how we started Westervelt Ecological Services. It's a long-term use of land. And you can still, in some of those circumstances, you can still manage timber. So our profit model we talked about internally was called revenue stacking. How many streams of revenue can we stack on a given acre of land? So we've got timberland. We get revenue from the thinnings, which happens at about year 15 or 16, and from the final harvest. You've got recreational lease income. 95% of the land that we own in Alabama, we also we rent it to hunting camps. So it's consistent with growing timber. That's another stream of revenue. Some of that land has coal bed gas or coal on it. That can be consistent with, depending on how it's done. So we looked at the ways we can maximize the stream. So if you look at our land base, this is where we start. Then from there, what can you do with it? So you try to get the streams of revenue per acre. We measure that, dollars of revenue per acre, and the different ways to generate that. And then from there, you start going downstream. You can probably see my dog. He's demanding my attention. So I've got a 13-year-old English setter, English pointer, and a 12-year-old English setter. Go away. Okay, so that's the model was trying to stay within that, but also looking at the edges. So Jack Warner always encouraged us to try things. And I'll tell you about some things we tried that didn't work very well, and what do you learn from that? But he was always looking for adjacencies. So it had to be somewhat related, but it wouldn't have to be directly related. It was like, if you're here, you might want to think about here. We tried things like, we bought a company that made folding cartons, and they also had a business that made Chinese pails. We didn't know anything about the pails. We didn't even know they were part of the company until we got to, doing our due diligence. Didn't really want it, but the guy says, yeah, you got to take this. It's simple stuff. We thought it's a really simple product to make. You probably do it in your garage. The most profitable business we were ever in. It's a distribution business. It's not about how well you make the product. It's how do you get a box of Chinese pails at every Chinese restaurant in the country. So that was kind of interesting to learn that. We started a business. We were doing some work where we were looking at buying some timberland. We'll talk about that perhaps later. And there are a couple ways to assess the timberland. A lot of it is you send a forester out, and they simply walk it. They do sampling, and they give us an idea about the site quality, how good is the soil. That's called the site index. The stocking level, which is how many trees per acre, and are they healthy trees? They're not healthy trees. Well, that's okay if you're buying 1,000, 2,000 acres. In 2005, when we had $100 million to put into timberland, and we would look at things that were 20,000, 30,000 or more acres, that was problematic. Well, there was a company, Landwork, that they did it through satellite imaging. Smart guys, mostly PhDs out of Chicago, and we were just really, impressed with. So they could do that, take satellite shots, can tell you when a stand of trees is being stressed because of heat or weather. So we met these guys, and like I said, I was impressed with them. And well, what else can you do? And so we ended up buying their company. Two guys that formed the company. Well, within about 3 or 4 years, the number of timberland transactions started to really slow down. We're thinking, well, what are we going to do with this? Well, we said, what else? Who else needs this kind of information? Crop forecasting. So we grew the company to the point, sold it to Bloomberg we owned it about 5 years. And they did crop forecasting, and we sold, our clients were Archer Daniels, Midland, Cargill. We did crop forecasting around the world. Palm in Malaysia, wheat in Russia, because you could do it from Chicago if you had the data. You may say, well, then why on earth did you sell it? We weren't big enough to scale it. They need to be part of something even bigger. So, but that was an interesting, was it related? Initially it was related because they did timberland, evaluations. But then the technology took them in another direction.
There was a lot to get into there, and I really appreciate everything you just shared with us about the company. I'm having a hard time just summarizing it and taking it all in. There's such a interesting progression just from the very beginning, how you started there, and ultimately the decision-making process and the thinking you had along the way, and some of those cool specific stories about the different business segments and the different innovations and realizations you brought in along the way. I especially was really drawn to the idea of the generational timeline for decision-making. Something that really stuck out to me was you just said this, but where do we want to own timberland 50 years from now? I think that long-term thinking is one of the great advantages you all had. And that's something that Kyle and I hardly see in the world anymore. And everyone's acting on, and part of this could be due to technology and the iterative cycles and how things move so much faster. But I mean, even nationally and in other companies, people are thinking in the timescales of like 1 year, 5 years, how fast can we move this along? And the way you're talking about maximizing opportunities for generations to come. And I think that's probably influenced by the fact that the business is kept in the family and wants to move on. But what I really want to highlight is like the thought process you showed along the way, how you were open-minded to new opportunities, the kind of logical and well-organized approach you took to the different business segments, maximizing the existing segments, being open to new ones. And it also really, really showed through the detail work how you learn the granular details of every one of those different places, from the extreme specifics about the trees and the equipment and the complications. And that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit more now. We kind of section this in our outline as the philosophy segment, which is going over some of the stuff you shared about mental models, habits, biases, and that's kind of what I want to focus on now. So starting off with mental models, the first question is that you gave a lot of stories about new segments. What are some of those mental models you used when evaluating those new opportunities?
Yeah, great question. I mean, obviously, we had a process of strategic, planning that happened at the board level. We would kind of understand where we were and then the direction we're going to be looking at, and that theirs was more of a long-term planning, 5 to 10 year cycles. And one of the benefits of not being a public company is we don't have quarterly earnings releases. We've got monthly P&Ls, but we still have to be accountable for that. But, we don't have to, if you try something new or you try a strategic shift, you don't have to be right immediately. Because sometimes part of your thought process is this is going to take some time to generate the critical mass to become profitable. As long as we thought we could get there. So we always ask ourselves the question, Lewis, do we have the core competency or can we acquire it? So there's 3 core competencies that we felt like, that we were exceptional about. One is managing timberlands in the Southeast U.S. We've been doing that for 70, 80 years. We go all the way back to, we generate our own seedlings. We have a nursery not far from Tuscaloosa, and we'll grow 6 to 7 million seedlings a year. We're in some genetic testing programs with different universities. NC State is one that's done a lot of work there. Virginia Tech has done a lot of work on improving the quality of the seedlings, making them more bug resistant, positive qualities. They're not Frankenstein trees. We're just genetically enhancing through natural techniques, selective breeding, if you will, which can be done at a nursery level. So, that's part of how our model for making those decisions is to understand the science behind it. So that's part of the strategic planning process. And we would have, with my management team, the leadership team, we would meet 4 times a year. Once was an extended couple of days. And we just did a lot of what if, okay, what are you guys seeing and hearing that, that maybe we ought to be considering? And then, we had to have honest conversations. So that conversation meter was a mental model about everybody's got to be comfortable to speak up and willing to, stand behind something and be accountable for it. So, inversion is taking something from the back end to the forward end. There might be some things that we didn't quite understand that would take them from, well, here's the outcome. You go backwards. What are all the assumptions that are underlying that you've got to believe in? And can you believe in those things? Like I said, the 3 things I skipped over. So 3 things we did, we thought were our core competencies was managing timberland in the Southeast U.S. The next one was converting southern yellow pine timber into high quality solid wood products. We ran a sawmill. We ran it very, very well. And then the third one was managing lands for biodiversity and sustainability. Like I said, we've got about 25,000 acres that once you put something into a conservation easement, which is the definition of how you perpetuate it for forevermore, that is a legal commitment. You've got to provide for the funding for whatever that land is, for whatever that purpose is, in perpetuity. So we've gotten very, very good at learning those things. So if we look at something that doesn't exactly fit into that, but we can make an acquisition in which you buy the intelligence, the land worth acquisition is a good one. We didn't have the intelligence and the focus that those guys were doing the satellite imaging and taking that data and making business decisions. But we invested in two people that could bring that core competency. They did that. So I think that's, I'm not sure I'm getting to the right mental models. There's this thing called the tragedy of the commons, and that is in a system where there's a shared resource that no one's really responsible for. Then through time, that shared resource is generally depleted. So we look at our opportunities in the mitigation banking business was just that. Had we not created these banks, these species may become extinct. Well, if we can provide the right habitat and provide a home for these endangered species, when someone wants to build on a piece of land anywhere, whether it's a road or an airport or Walmart, they've got to do an environmental impact study. Well, if they're in an area that has an endangered species, they have to mitigate that. And one of the ways they can mitigate it is they go out and buy land and create that habitat, which will take you 5 to 7 years, or they come to a bank that's authorized like we are, and they buy the credits from us. So it's a win-win. The developer gets quick access and ready authority to move forward. We've in addition to that, we have put this land aside. Most of the land that we've got in easements now are land that we didn't own. We bought it for a specific purpose. It was bought, maybe it was cattle land or farmland or something else. It wasn't necessarily timberland, although we've got some of that as well. So,
as a mitigation bank, you're giving out capital in the form of an easement. So like if I'm a developer and I'm building a big residential community, but I don't have enough land to appease the environmental council in my city, I can come to you and buy credits of easement.
Correct. And that severs, as a developer, that severs your legal liability. So let's just say that you're doing a development project in Tuscaloosa and you do the environmental impact and you found out there's some wetlands on that property. You either can not develop it, which is probably not what you want to do. You can try to go buy other property, and it's not just saving the wetlands. You've got to create new. So it's kind of it's a zero net impact. You can't just set it aside and say, I won't do anything with it. You've got to create new wetlands. Well, that's not your business. It's cumbersome, and it's front end loaded with capital. We'll go in and let's say that your project needed 20 acres. Well, that's a hard thing to maintain through time if you got to do it forever. We'll build a 1,000-acre bank, and it will be a wetlands bank, or it'll be a streamside impact bank. And then we get allocated through either the Corps of Engineers, or it could be Fish and Wildlife or other people, if it's a species or if it's water-based, a certain number of credits that we can sell. And then we set the price in the market. In the wetlands, for instance, you've got to be in the same basin, the same water basin, stream basin, as where your impact is, or you pay a penalty. You can buy it outside your area, but you pay a penalty for that. It's a fascinating business.
Yeah, that's something that I've never ever heard of or come into like contact with. That's really cool. Thank you for explaining that. But stepping back a little bit from your like really hard knowledge into something that all of us currently are trying to wrap our brains around and no one really understands. What mental models are you applying today to understand the current state of the world with coronavirus and the protests and the political polarization and all of these things? How are you thinking about the world?
That's a great question. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. The Knowledge Project, which I've told you about, it's Shane Parrish from Farnham Street.
It's fantastic.
That's one of my favorites. I started on that a couple of years ago, and I just really don't miss it. And I like Malcolm Gladwell's another guy that I listen to. But anyway, in that one, he's the one that got me started thinking about mental models. He's since self-published 2 books that have a listing of them. He's got 109 listed. He's published 2 books that have covered about 60. So we've got more to go. But to answer your question, one of the ones that it just catches my attention and my sense of humor is called Hanlon's razor. Now, you've heard of Occam's razor,
Yes.
which is simpler explanations are more likely to be true than complicated ones. Makes perfect sense. Well, there's a follow-up called Hanlon's razor, and it says we should not attribute to malice that which is more easily explained by stupidity. So to answer your question about what mental models do I apply in today's environment, I think a lot of the things that people say and do, I have to believe it's more of ignorance than it is malice. It can seem very hurtful. It can seem, very painful, very directed at a segment of the population. And I believe that it's probably more based on, he calls it stupidity, I would call it ignorance. So that's one. It's just trying to, understand how people think. Probabilistic thinking is one that, to your earlier question, Lewis, which ones do we apply? Well, you use logic and probability and statistics to determine what's the likely outcome. So as I've been following the COVID-19 outbreak from day one, and Johns Hopkins has got this wonderful grid that shows where the outbreaks are around the world, just trying to understand when people say, well, it's here and it can go to here, what's the likelihood, and which is the bigger error? It's not that bad, or it's worse than we thought. So I read something every day, and sometimes one thing conflicts with another. But I think that you pull together the data, you decide for yourself what are the reliable sources and which are the ones that just don't hold together very well. And I'm a data-driven. That was one of the things we talked about at our company was we made data-driven decisions. Somebody would say something, and you'd say, is that your opinion, or do you have data to back it up? Now, we're not trying to be snarky about it. We're simply saying, is that data-driven? And once you kind of push yourself to go away from your opinions and things that things I read on the internet, which must be true, you say, where's that data come from? And then even there, the whole thing with fake news, that's such an abused term, I even hate using it. But you've got to be careful, you've got to do enough of your own due diligence and investigation to decide, is that a good source of data? And is it used correctly? Is it the right context? Is it the right time period? So I don't know if those are mental models, but it's, I think don't jump to the first conclusion. And that's kind of a bias that we have, is the first thing that pops in your mind must be the right thing. So I'm probably more focused on understanding my cognitive biases and trying to avoid those, because we all have them. And sometimes they serve you well, most of the time they don't. And just being aware of those things. And I found out when somebody's saying something that irritates me, I'm probably best just to be quiet, stay irritated, and listen. And then try to ask the good question about, what makes you feel that way? Or where'd you get that information? And you can do that. And you guys are good at this because you interview people. You can challenge someone without insulting someone. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the discourse that goes on, in the political arena today is not that way. But I think that there's a way that we learn by. So tell me more about that. What led you to that conclusion? So I don't know. It's not a good answer as to about which mental model that I use. I mean, there's so many of them. Butterfly effect is one. There was a great book. Got the guy that wrote that, Rick, somebody. That says small changes in the initial conditions can have massive downstream impact. So it's the idea of a butterfly in England flaps his wings, could it cause a hurricane in Indonesia? And it's like this leads to this leads to this. So I think we've got to be careful about, sometimes we're trying to find solutions to existing problems, to be careful that the law of unintended consequences doesn't step in and say you get the exact opposite of what you're trying to do. I can't tell you the number of times I thought I was helping someone, and it had the exact opposite impact. And you didn't see it coming. You thought, okay, well, this is going to be helpful, and I'm going to do this for them. And sometimes it just doesn't work out that way.
I think that's a really interesting commentary on the different mental models you're using right now. And it's tough. It's one of those things, I also am a big fan of Shane Parrish, Farnham Street, the Knowledge Project, and just being aware of them and knowing that they exist can be helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've immediately kind of been implemented into your thinking and they're augmenting your decision-making, just that you're aware of them. And I think the same is true for cognitive biases. You've clearly also studied those and cataloged some, but my question is, how do you, take that awareness of what they are and like an intellectual understanding of what they are and what they imply into actually structuring your decision making in a way that overcomes a lot of the common ones?
That's I wish I had a great answer. That's a great question, Lewis. I'm not sure that I've got a great answer other than just trying to learn from your mistakes. You know, I've had, I can think back to when I was working and we'd have a meeting and there was, you know, we didn't accomplish the purpose of the meeting. It kind of broke down into, you know, I think this, I think that, and it was just, it's not going anywhere. And I go back to my office thinking, you know, that could have had a better outcome. What could I have done? And with the time to think about it, you kind of come up with, okay, well, if this happens again, I'm going to ask this question, or we're going to put this person, you know, give them the responsibility to explain that. So that's, you know, I don't know. That's, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, it's a tough question because I mean, I think that's the core question for people that read books like, you know, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, because that's been recommended by numerous guests. And, you know, they talk about confirmation bias is fairly easy to, I wouldn't say fairly, that's like a common one that everyone brings up. And I read a really interesting book that gave a interesting perspective on how to overcome that in research by like building arguments bottom up, which is kind of like only structuring an opinion or only structuring, it's basically like gathering evidence and forming a hypothesis based on the evidence instead of like the scientific method, which is form a hypothesis and then try to build an experiment that proves it. And I think that is like a natural situation that lends itself to the confirmation bias. And I think using the internet for research only amplifies when that situation. Whereas if, you know, you just read a bunch of books out of straight curiosity and you take detailed notes about the ideas that come to you, and then at that point you look back on the notes you have and the ideas you've put together, then you come out with a more unbiased thought. But I think that's only an answer to one cognitive bias, right? And the answer might be that you have to kind of structure systems like that and research processes and decision processes to accompany any other cognitive bias that you think of. So whether it's like, I think anchoring is another cognitive bias, right? Where, you know, when someone mentions a number to you, you all of a sudden become tied to their number. That one, you probably have to also come up with a way to like almost refresh your memory to like get their thought out of your head. And maybe the answer to that one is that the only way to overcome that is that you give the number first and you control that cognitive bias, right? So I think the answer is you have to actually, step one is cataloging them. And then it's probably step two is cataloging remedies to them, because you can't just say, okay, I'm making a decision. This is like the very like Charlie Munger-esque idea, right? It's like, okay, I'm approached with the situation. Let me look at my list of mental models from Shane Parrish and Charlie Munger. Let me look at my list of cognitive biases from Kahneman and Tversky. And then I'm going to read that and make sure everything comes to, I like reach the optimal conclusion. And I'm not sure what that answer is, but I think it's definitely an improvement to consult those resources in those situations, but I don't know how practical it is either. And that also might come with practice. So
I agree.
It's a long-winded answer to a tough question, but it's my fault for asking it.
It's a great question, and I think some of them like reciprocity. You know, that's part of maybe more of a mental model is it because you talked about the anchoring. So reciprocity means if I do something for you, no matter how small, and then I ask a favor of you, you kind of feel compelled to respond in a positive way. So there are a lot of these things that are kind of in sales 101. You can look up and say, here's how they manipulate you. Those are kind of things that just to be aware of, that you have these cognitive biases, or they were just human biases that draw us toward what does society accept or expect. And just be aware of that. You know, we tend to think that, you know, we see something, a bad outcome for someone else as a poor decision making, but the same bad outcome for us was, well, these were things beyond my control.
Or circumstances.
So, circumstances. So, well, it really wasn't my fault. We tend to think we know what other people are thinking. Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking with Strangers, if you've not read that, is just a phenomenal. It's his latest book, and it's kind of talks about that. Is part of our problem is we already think we know what they mean, and we think we're good at processing. We put a premium on being able to read people quick and kind of coming to the right answer, and that just takes us in the wrong direction. So I think one of them that kind of comes forward is if you listen to someone talk and they say things that you believe in, for me, my opinion of them as being intelligent goes way up because they're saying things that I would have said anyway. So he's a smart guy. So when I find myself kind of leaning in that, you know, I'm agreeing with everything they say, I have to kind of step back to say, why do I think what they're saying is right? Because I believe the same thing. So those little things you kind of catch yourself doing. We tend to think that, you know, we try harder than other people. The other thing I know that happens is that We tend to rewrite our recall, our memory of things that happened. That's one of the things that Malcolm talks about in that book, is that there are actual events that take place. And then years go by and your memory, and you're certain of this, I mean, you're not a little fuzzy on it. Well, I remember specifically this. Those things get changed depending on the experience. Was it a good experience or a bad experience? And the bad ones tend to get rewritten through time. It's part of that perception. If 5 people look at the same crime and you interview 5 eyewitnesses, they can give you 5 different answers as to what happened. It's because their perception's different. So I'm conscious of perceptions. I'm conscious of the fact that, and that's probably because I'm almost 63, that your memory fades. But I've seen that happen to people that in their 20s that, that wasn't what happened at all, but that's what you remembered. So those are the kind of things just to catch yourself from making those. You can catch yourself if you work at it.
I think that catching yourself. I think that catching yourself. Sorry.
If you're fortunate, you've been married 41 years, you have someone who will catch them for you.
Yeah. Well, we're not there yet, but maybe one day. But stepping back and catching your biases is a habit. And that's one thing that we also wanted to get into is your framework of habits versus goals. You actually really had a profound impact on me last year when you came and spoke to the academy, because you said that early on in your career, you had a mentor who asked you what your goals were, and you said, I don't know. And then I think the rest of the story goes, he just like sent you away or something like that. But, that inspired in me to start to create my own goals, and, it really affected me. But I just wanted to know what is the difference between habits and goals to you?
Okay. And obviously they're both important. And I think the story I was telling you about was an early mentor. He said, every year I go on vacation and I'll take a day, whether it's at the mountains or the beach, and I take out my little, it's not it's just something he keeps his thoughts in. And it's not a diary per se, and I look at my goals for that year. What did I accomplish? So he said, your goals will change as your situation changes, as your place in life changes. He said, but you've got to have goals. That gives you a target. So for me, the goal is the what. What do I want to have accomplished? I want to start my own business before I'm 25. They have to be specific. They've got to be measurable. They've got to be actionable. So you've got to be able to do all those things. So that's the what. The how part's the tough part, and that's the tactical part, and those are the habits. We will have good or bad habits. Good habits take you toward your goals. Bad habits take you away from them. You're going to have one or the other. You don't get to pick, I don't have any habits. Well, you don't have any habits, you're a procrastinator, and that's a habit. So the James Clear book, Atomic Habits, I thought he did a good job of kind of describing the best way to build strong, positive habits and the best ways to kind of avoid the negative habits that come along. I believe in cues. I'm a visual person. And one of the things he says, make it visible. Your habit that you're trying to accomplish, whether it's taping it to my bathroom mirror that I see every morning, or just somewhere where you can't ignore it. That's one. Make it fun, make it attractive to you. It's something I want to do. So everybody use the example, I want to lose 25 pounds. Although neither one of you guys could stand that. But if you want to lose weight, that could be a goal. But just because you want to lose weight, you could say, well, then I'll eat less. I won't, I'll give up beer and pretzels. Well, that requires self-discipline, and self-discipline sometimes runs out at the worst possible moment. So that's not the way you're going to accomplish it. But if you say, I'm going to exercise for an hour each day, I'm going to go low on my carbs, these are things that you can measure each and every day. Those are things that can get you to accomplish your goal. A goal will at some point you'll achieve it. My goal when I was in your shoes was to, I want to get a job. I want to be a brand manager, but I wanted to be in the sales and marketing side. I enjoy the psychology of all that. When I joined Gulf State's paper, as far as I could see up the org chart of me ever getting was going to be a vice president of sales for one of the 4 divisions. We had three divisions. That was as far as my vision could take me. And I wasn't quite sure, if I would ever get there, and would it take me 30 years to do it. So was that my goal? Yeah. Did I work on that every day? Not really, but I did develop good habits of constantly reading. I remember I used to read the Harvard Business Review. I think it came out in hard copy form once a month. I did appreciate the fact that you don't stop learning when you finish college. You never do stop learning, you know. And so I had that. I can thank my parents for this intellectual curiosity. Both of my parents got their graduate degrees while I was in high school. So they kept where I used to see them at home studying at night while I should have been at home studying at night. So, you know, I get that, you know, naturally from them. But it's that commitment you have to keep learning. So I always look for opportunities to be part of teams. No one outworked me. I looked for, you know, unique approaches to things, was willing to try things. And I was fortunate. I can't tell you, you know, I just gave you my history of I went from selling cartons to one day running the company. No part of that path said it takes you there. I just happened to be kind of right place, right time, with the right organization, with the right team around me. I was just very fortunate. It could have gone, you know, 100 other ways.
Yeah, I think that whole discussion, I mean, I also really enjoy studying habits, and it's really the idea of process over outcomes is the big signifying difference between the habits and goals, right? With goals, which are good to have as a signpost and for direction, they're very outcome driven. You know, it's very binary. You achieve the goal, you don't achieve the goal. Whereas habits are focusing on positive processes where that over time, if you follow them, are moving you in the right direction. And then the reaching the goal is a side effect of having followed that process. And that's the real intended consequence of designing good habits. Another question we have for you, and you're sharing a few of your specific habits, you know, lifelong learning and reading and intellectual curiosity, is morning routine. Because I know that's a huge part of a lot of these books on habits is morning routine. That's your first habits of the day. My question is, what was your morning routine as CEO, and how is that different from your morning routine now?
Okay, quickly think back. Well, the morning routine wasn't that different, Lewis. You know, I got up. I get up at 6 o'clock. You know, when I was working, maybe it was 5:30. But my daughter left me with these dogs. Left us these dogs when she moved to Dallas a long time ago. So I've had these dogs for about 8 or 9 years. So part of my morning routine is I get up. I take them now to the dog park. Over here by Sokol Park, and we spend a half an hour walking around. That gets their exercise. I come back, I stretch, I make a protein shake or something like that for breakfast. I come back, turn on my computer. I get subscribed to Bloomberg and to Wall Street Journal. So I read those first thing every morning, and then I'll look through the blogs I like. And so I'll spend probably an hour sitting here, you know, doing those kind of things, and then I'll get up, and then I'll either go play tennis, go hit on the ball machine, go play golf, I'll go hit golf balls. And it's at least 2 to 3 hours of physical exertion. I've got a treadmill I run on, I've got weights I can lift. So so now how it's different is I used to have to wait till I got home at night when I worked to do those physical things. It was hard to do, you know, early in the day. I get to read a lot more now. So the first part of my day, it's about the same. The last part of my day, I actually stay up later than I used to. I used to go to bed at 9 because I would get up at 5 or so, 5 or 5:30. So I like the freedom of choosing how to spend that time. When I was working, it was hard for me to read a nonfiction book. I love historical novels. Now, you know, I had a bookshelf full of about 40 or 50 books that I had acquired through time. That, you know, one day when I retire, I'm going to read Atlas Shrugged. Have you read Atlas Shrugged?
I read The Fountainhead this year in February,
yeah,
which took me about that whole month to read. You know, I don't know when it was. I read it recently, maybe last summer actually. But I have Atlas Shrugged next to it on my bookshelf in Tuscaloosa, so it's on the list.
Well, I had to wait till I retired, because it's a great read, but it's, as you know, it's about 1,200 pages, and it's not an easy read. But there are a lot of similarities between what Ayn Rand was describing and kind of what's going on today. So, and I guess The Fountainhead was the precursor to Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, The Fountainhead was her first novel, and then Atlas Shrugged was considered the masterpiece. I don't know if Fountainhead was her first or not. First big novel. There's some other works in the mix. Right. Not an Ayn Rand expert, but I do have an Ayn Rand biography next to the Ayn Rand books, which I haven't read either. But
well, you'll have to tell me about that one. I'm going to get to that one. And the other thing I like, and Kyle knows this, what I enjoy doing is I spend some time with a nonprofit board. I'm very engaged in our church, First Methodist, which is a big church downtown, working with the University of West Alabama on some workforce development things in the Black Belt specifically, trying to We've gotten some federal grants to do some specific training in that part of West Alabama, the Black Belt. So I have the time. I've got some experience to try to share. To the degree it's helpful, share, here's what I've learned, didn't make it perfect, and here are the mistakes I made, and you can try to avoid these.
What habits do you think are most important for people our age, like around 20, to adopt in order to grow and learn and long-term be successful?
Yeah, it's well, I would say both of you guys are successful, so what are your habits?
That's a good script flipping question. Well, I think Kyle and I have one very easy answer for that right now. It's a 75-day challenge with 6 habits that you have to maintain for that 75 days. I think there's a meta habit I have of picking up like challenges. And like
I have a meta habit of following Lewis doing these.
But 6 habits that Kyle and I are both doing right now, and there's some incredible benefits to doing these, is drinking a gallon of water every day. So full gallon of water. That's important for feeling good mentally, physically. And then 2 workouts. So similar to your exercise habit, we do 2 45-minute workouts every day. One of them has to be outside, which I think is a hugely important piece of that for just getting the vitamin D exposure, getting that perspective, being out in nature. Usually that is either walking or running or biking. Those are the main outdoor activities. And I think that's super beneficial for thinking and taking a break from work. And then you have to follow a diet. You set your own diet on this plan. But I think, you can't set your diet to be a bad diet, obviously. And I think, so those are just habits of like maintaining your body for physical performance to be able to keep up and be energetic and take on a lot of work and actually finish it without crashing. And I think that's a huge habit, the over encompassing habit of taking care of yourself through those specific things, sunlight, water, whatever. Then it also is just the general habit. But then the other 2 pieces, you take a progress picture every day, which I think is a very process-driven habit. So you take a picture of yourself in the mirror to show your physical improvements from the beginning of the 75 days to the end. And that kind of teaches the habit of like a small thing every day. And then over time, it's a very like process input type habit. You don't drink alcohol during this challenge. I think that's a good habit. I don't think, I'm not opposed to any consumption of alcohol. I've clearly had some in my life. I'm 21. So I had my first sip of alcohol, however long ago what my birthday was, obviously for our listeners. And then what else is there, Kyle? Then you read 10 pages of nonfiction, and it has to be on paper. And again, the importance of the paper is that physical gratification of feeling progress as you move through the book. And I guess the designer of the challenge's assertion that it's just better to read physical books. And obviously reading, a habit you shared, is very important for being exposed to new ideas and learning new things on your own. And you can choose your own books, so you follow your own curiosity, and that's also a good habit. So that's those are 6 habits I'll share for now.
Great. It's you touched on, if I put mine in 4 categories, and how much time you spend is up to you. It's doing something intellectual every day, do something physical every day, do something spiritual every day, and do something emotional every day. Touch your emotions, whether it's laughing. I'm not saying you should cry every day, but you just should be in a position where you get, that's kind of why you hang out with friends, that's where you get some emotional nourishment. You get that in relationships. You get that watching a movie, or whatever. But you got to, so I think those are the 4 things that, and in retirement, I can spend more time doing those things. But I think you're on the right track. It's the developing the discipline. That's the key thing. Habits are only as good as your commitment to doing them. And all the things that you described there, you get to see the benefit. It does work. It can be small things that have a compounding effect that over time can have a huge, back end enjoyment. So I'd say those are the things, so I don't, like I said, it's, for me, spirituality can be whatever it is to you. Some people say, well, I can go sit out in the woods, or I go sit by my duck pond, or I go out on the lake, and for me that's spiritual. That's fine. I think that it's being able to kind of pull yourself out of something else to say, I'm going to focus on that. There's a guy's name, Rob. It's called The Art of Noticing. And I picked up, it was one of the recommendations that Shane Parrish had.
Rob Walker?
Rob Walker, yeah. Did you read that book, The Art of Noticing?
No, I just searched it quickly.
Well, it's a fairly easy read, and you can make it really easy. But it's about, he just kind of gets you to pay attention. So, if you're going to go out for your run or your bike ride, it's not just I'm slugging through this to get through with it. being aware of the things that are going on around you. How many times have I gone by this building and never noticed this? And I think to me, that's an improvement. Is I try to be every day, particularly when I go on the walk with the dogs, because I usually listen to a podcast, is I just try to notice something I haven't noticed before. Pick one thing that I can say, well, I didn't notice that before. So that's one of the things that I'm working on, is being more observant to what's different or changed.
Definitely. I think that's a huge piece of the outdoor component of our workout, is that opportunity to pay attention to the little things, especially, it's that exposure to nature. That's kind of what I was hinting at earlier. So you appreciate, the warmth of the sun or the natural sights around you. I'm in very desert landscapes right now, but even that has its own kind of unique beauty. And then watching the cars, it's just, especially if you go without entertainment, without music or without an audiobook, that really forces you to find entertainment and thoughtfulness in your surroundings. So that it's not intentionally a spiritual component, but it sometimes serves that purpose. And also, you made the point there about discipline. And I think you could even make the argument that discipline itself is a habit. And I think that's one thing that I've learned a lot from the 75-day challenge, because the 75-day challenge, to do it properly, is high stakes, where if you screw up one component and you miss that piece for that day, you start at day 0. So you have to have 75 consecutive days, which is what makes it a challenge. And it's that discipline. It's kind of using the fear of failure as that built-in accountability mechanism. But at a certain point, it's to teach you to be accountable to yourself, and then discipline when you're really serious about something. And it's like you can create your own stakes for failure. It's like you wouldn't view yourself positively for not fulfilling a commitment you made to yourself. That's kind of where discipline can almost, the role for it can be taken out. And that's kind of a theme we touched on a little bit, where you design positive habits and discipline becomes less necessary. But in general, making it a habit of being disciplined to the commitments you make to yourself is beneficial, and something I'm definitely working towards. Kyle, do you want to move to the bonus section now?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've talked a lot on this podcast about reading and books, and we all like to read. But one question that we wanted to ask you is, what book have you gifted the most to people?
I like that question because it means it meant something to you. I'd say over my career, it's this one. It's called The Communication Catalyst. This is the one I mentioned that Richard and Mickey Connolly wrote. Yeah, it holds up. I read it every year, and I'll read the entire book. It's written as a little novel, but there's just a lot of wisdom that's sewn in through that. It's about a barbecue place in Texas. I'm sharing more than that, but it's an easy read. I read that, and I always try to keep 4 or 5, because I'll give away 4 or 5 a year. So I like that one because it hasn't lost its relevance through time. So that, and the other book that when I was at Westervelt that we would give to every new salaried employee was a book called The Servant by James Hunter. It's about leadership, and it's about leadership from a servant's perspective. Good book. I would highly recommend that. I think he's written an update to it. I haven't written the update, but that's one that it doesn't lose its relevance through time. The most recent ones are 2 that I really love. One's called Seeking Wisdom, From Darwin to Munger. It was written by a guy named Peter Bevelin. And it's about how we think, the psychologies of misjudgment, how physics and math figure into our misjudgments, and then how we learn and guides to better thinking. It's a slow read because it's just jam full. It's dense with content. And I think Kyle's probably told you this. I like the physical books because I like the tactile feel of touching something, but I also write notes. If you've ever seen a book, I've got notes all over it. And then once I've read it, I'll go back and then I'll do a Word document summary of here's what I learned from that book. So that way, if I'm looking for something, it's almost like an extended index. Okay, it was in this book. So so that's one, Seeking Wisdom. And then the other one is called The Emperor of All Maladies. Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's about the biography of cancer. It's about 700 pages. Again, not an easy read, but he does a great job of taking you through from a layman's perspective with some medical overlay to it. How have we treated it historically? How has that changed? What does the future look like? So I read that and bought 5 copies and sent them to people that I know that had somebody in their family impacted by cancer. It gives you a greater appreciation for the challenge, and then hopefully the possibilities of, there is one of the things I learned, it almost says in day one, there is no one cancer. There are variations of cancers in your body. So to expect that to be a cure in the 60s, their slogan was, the National Institute of Health was, let's go to cure cancer. Well, then they realized there's too many of them and they behave in too many ways. So you start to understand about, the importance of testing. And as you get older, there are exams that you'll go through that have a good chance of. I lost a brother 2 years ago to cancer. I lost a mother about 3 years ago to cancer, different types of cancer, different reasons. But, virtually everybody's been impacted. That's a great book. And it's actually, if you don't want to read it, I like reading first, but I think on Netflix, there's a documentary that was done. It could be on Amazon Prime. It was about, 3 episodes or a couple hours per episode. It really follows the book very well. I found that's a fascinating book. And I've told Kyle, there's so much in my life I don't know much about. I married my math tutor in college because I wasn't good at calculus. And today she gave me a book called The Joy of X. And it's not math for dummies. It's a history of math and how you use formulas. I mean, she's taught me you mentioned earlier, Lewis, we were talking about input processes and inputs versus outcomes. And everything with her is Y as a function of X. Y is the outcome, X's are the input variables. So I begin to look at life through Y as a function of X. So she's impacted me by her math skills. She still teaches college kids and high school kids math and calculus every semester. And she does it because it keeps her sharp. And I always walk through the kitchen and she always asks me a question she knows I don't know the answer to. And she'll go, and he was a CEO. Can you believe that? He didn't know how to do signing.
That's funny. And that's funny that you brought up education and teaching, because that was actually my next question. So like I shared with you before this call, I'm an out-of-state student at the University of Alabama. I came on a scholarship from Las Vegas. When I showed up, University of Alabama is this pristine, gorgeously manicured campus with more out-of-state students than in students. It's nationally credible. It's huge, and it's probably completely different than what it was when you went there back in the 70s and 80s. I was curious what it was like for you as a student at the University of Alabama, because it was such a different place back then. What are some differences you've observed between then and now? I mean, you just have such a big perspective on Tuscaloosa history. Like, it's funny to me, before this conversation, I just know about Jack Warner Parkway. That's like the road wrapping around the backside of campus following the river. And for you, he's like a major mentor in your life. That's like a real person, not just the name of a road. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on some of that Tuscaloosa UA history over time.
Good question, Lewis. I came here in January of 76. And with the exception of about 2 years that Linda and I lived in Birmingham, I've lived here all that time. When I came here, I think the student population was 19,000. There were major lecture halls in Bidgood, which is the old Bidgood, that weren't air conditioned. I sound like I rode to school in a dinosaur. I mean, it was that bad everywhere. But it was not, and the dorms were just hideous. I didn't ever live in a dorm because I had a friend who did, and it was awful. So you compare it there to here, the campus was smaller. I'd say with the classes perhaps more intimate. I don't know what the classroom experience is like today. We had a few well, yeah, true, virtually. But before the virus, I felt like the professors were very accessible. The classes were generally smaller, but things were different. We didn't have a calculator. The engineering students used calculators, but we didn't use calculators. Didn't have obviously PCs. We did simulation games like Lonnie Strickland. I don't know if either one of you are taking GBA 490. One of the best courses I've ever had, and he and I have stayed in touch, and I still have my book. I can always tell how good a class was if I didn't sell my book 15 minutes after the exam. I kept it for some reason. It meant something, and I've still got that book. But we had to card punch. You go down to a punching thing, you punch the card, you win them in, put them in there. That's how we ran the simulation. So the technology has changed. It was a beautiful campus, just bigger now. I'm trying to think that, I had fond memories of it. My first 2 years in school, I was in a fraternity. So I didn't probably spend as much time on my academics those first 2 years than I should have, or that my parents expected me to. But I got through. I was in business school and then got married. And from 79 on, I was paying my own way, and it was time to get serious about it. So I did quite well, got into graduate school, made 1B, all A's in graduate school. But the experience, I was still back in the Bear Bryant eras. This is really going to sound old to you. I think Bryant coached into 81, 82. So we were still big deals, just like we are today, with Saban. We were big deals in football. So it was kind of known as a, place for championship football teams. But then the city changed with, JVC came to town in the early 90s and built a big, I think they made VHS tapes and compact disc. A big factory. And then, of course, when Mercedes came in the later part of the 90s, it changed the whole dynamics of the campus. I'll give Bob Witt as a guy that deserves a lot of credit. I've been on the president's cabinet for quite a while when Bob first got here. And he came in the first meeting. He told us what his vision was going to be. And he showed us how the in-state funding from the state was going this way. It was going down every year. And if we wanted to grow and compete with the best of the best, we had to bring in out-of-state students. He explained how he was going to put recruiters into various states that graduated more high school students that could go to school at state universities, Florida, Texas, California, and some others. And we went from 19,000 to 38,000, and we got.
Sounds about right.
When Bob got here, we were about 22, and he says our goal within 5 years is to get to 26, 27. We were at 30. The quality of the student population today is just incredibly impressive. I'm glad I'm not working anymore because I don't have to compete with guys like you. Yeah, you guys get it. You're committed to it. You're willing to make sacrifices in your discipline. So I'm very impressed with the quality of students at this university. Yeah, it was. I have nothing but fond memories. Both of our kids. Our son got a degree in business, graduated in 2009. My daughter got her master's in marketing in 2006. She lives in Nashville now. She's a mother of two. And our son went to Jackson Hole, Wyoming for the summer in 2009. He's still there. So that's where he lives and loves the lifestyle out there. So, yeah, nothing but fond memories. And one of the wonderful things that hopefully when you're my age, you look back, we had about 3 or 4 really close friends that have stayed close friends all these years. So we've gone through first wives, second wives, sometimes third wives, but we're always doing things as couples. And we still do one trip every year. We've been to New Zealand, we've been to Italy. We've always go to a national championship game if it's available. So that's also kind of a part of that. The experience that you had is not just what you learn in the classroom. You forget a lot of the facts of what you learn, but you won't forget how you learn to think, how you learn to process, how you learn to make decisions and develop confidence, in your decision making. That's the really great part. Now, to me, graduate school was so much better. I enjoyed it, one, because I was probably more committed to it. But at the graduate school level, the teachers treated you closer to being peers. There was respect because, if you made a C, you're out anyway. So I think it was more of a collaborative, peer type of relationship. I think it's still a fabulous university, and I'm proud of the business school and how it's continued to progress. So yeah, it's changed. Will it keep getting bigger? I'm not sure. Outside, let's say the virus disappears tomorrow. There's this. I think this virus is, in my humble opinion, this virus is going to change the way we educate. Once we've learned how to do things remotely and online, and I'm a big fan of the Khan Academy. I saw an interview on 60 Minutes of him 10 years ago. Brilliant guy, and I love what they're doing. So I think the future is probably less bricks and mortar and more, one faculty member helping out 10 people at 10 different levels.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And actually, one of our previous guests, Dion, he's working actively on an alternative to a university that I'm sure will benefit from the coronavirus, because all their learning is online, and the students live in different cities over the course of their schoolwork. But we have one last question for you, and it's based off a framework that I like to think about for my own life, and that is imagining that you're 80 years old and looking back on life and thinking, which moments would I spend the most money to be back inside of? Because for me, this really flips everything on its head, because
Conversion.
We work constantly to be in these moments of high achievement, right? But those aren't the moments that I would pay the most for. The moments that I would pay the most for are the ones where I'm, experiencing emotions with people that I love. or doing or being on a trip, or all these memories that don't have to do specifically with me, and that's what I'm working toward constantly. So it really tells me to like try and seek out those experiences that I would pay more for when I'm 80 years old. So for you, looking back at your age, what moments would you spend the most money for, to go back to?
Well, they're like what you just said about your own preferences, and that is it's the experiential things. It's there were things that happened throughout my working career that were particular moments I enjoyed. But would I trade a year of my life to go back and do that? No. It's the things that we got to do with our children. Our daughter Carly's 36, Andrew's 35. So when they were like in high school, we went down to the British Virgin Islands a couple of times, rented a sailboat, and I remember waking up on Christmas morning on a sailboat, with my two kids. Now there was a captain and there was a cook, but because I'm not a sailor, but those are moments you think I'll never forget this. We went to about 4 years ago. We went to, before Carly got married, so she's been married 3 years. We went to South Africa on a photo safari. Flew to Johannesburg, 15 and a half hours, by the way, from Atlanta to Johannesburg. That was kind of brutal. I told them they could have all they could drink on the way there. But we spent, 10 days together. Went to Kruger National Wildlife Refuge, and you got to pet elephants and tigers and just things that we got to do that as a family. So it's all those shared experiences like that. Some that we've been to Italy together. The friend trips are wonderful things. So it is experiential, and for the most part, it is with your family or the people you love, the people that care. They're going to be part of your life. I was lucky. I grew up in Decatur, Alabama. In that time, it was probably 25,000 people. And Huntsville wasn't a lot bigger then, but because of the Marshall Space Flight program and then the Redstone Arsenal, it just exploded. My dad worked over there, commuted daily. But, older brother, younger sister. My brother's just barely a year older than me. My sister's about 14 months younger than me. Eventually, my parents figured out what was causing all this, so there was only just three of us. But I grew up in that kind of a household, and then my mother's side of the family, my maternal grandmother, was one of 9 children that were still, when I was, 10, they were all still alive. So we would have usually Sunday lunches at my grandmother's house, and everybody stayed 20 cousins there. So there was that sense of belonging. This was right or wrong, goofy or not goofy. These are my people. And you kind of got to know them, and we've stayed in touch, through all these years. So it's those things that kind of give you a sense of place, a sense of purpose. I agree with you. You got to work hard, but you're not working. There's an old adage: you never see a U-Haul being pulled by a hearse. One, because you can't take that stuff
good.
with you, and no one ever on no one's tombstone ever read, "I wish I had worked more." That's not it either. So, but there is that balance. I mean, the things you accomplish, work-wise, career-wise, give you satisfaction. It also provides you the opportunities to do with the other things that have lasting meaning. And that's just those experiences that you have with your family. So I've got mental images, not mental models, but I've got mental images of all of these things we've done. My son was 10 years old. We sat in Atlanta in 1996 and watched the Braves win the World Series. That's the only one they've won. They went a bunch of times, but we were there that night and still have pictures of us sitting behind the dugout. He'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. We taught our kids to ski initially, and then we went out west to some places out there. So that's the reason you do all the stuff that's sometimes challenging and wears you out, is you get to replenish your batteries and renew your soul by the experiences that you spend your time with. So if I could, that plus being able to get out of bed in the morning and walk and not have some part of your body hurt, it'd be nice to have that as well. But that's just a function of age.
Yeah, that was an incredible answer. Really exactly what I was looking for. I wanted a story like that. But Mike, thank you so much for your time. Lewis and I really appreciate the level of preparation that you put into this conversation beforehand and during. The level of detail and everything that you mentioned in all of our conversations has really always blown me away. from the story at Westervelt to how you learn to mental models. You're clearly deeply intellectually curious in a wide range of areas. Lewis and I branded this conversation early on as learning through conversation. And I think we definitely met that goal in this episode. So thank you for coming on with us.
Oh, Kyle, it was certainly my pleasure. And Lewis, it's great to meet you. And one day we'll actually do it in person.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, that wraps up our interview with Mike. It was an incredible couple hours there talking about his habits, the way he develops goals, the way he communicates, and really just the way he looks at the world. Lewis, what do you think?
Yeah, Kyle, I completely agree with that. He and I really hit it off well for the first time we'd ever met. I'm really looking forward to hopefully meeting him again this fall in Tuscaloosa and getting to know him a little more better in person. But it was a great conversation. I hope our viewers enjoyed it. If they want to support the show and like episodes like this and help us keep growing the show and reach more people, the best way for them to do that is leaving a rating or review on iTunes, or just simply sending a link to an episode that you think a friend would like to that friend. That's the best way for us to promote our content to more people. So with that, you can find us on social media on pretty much every major platform by searching for The Lewis and Kyle Show if you want to get updates there. Otherwise, just check back here wherever you're listening in about another week, and we'll put another episode there. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.